Procurement. I'm sure, like me, even the mention of the word gets your engines revving. Finally, something we can all get excited about. People all across the world, all races, sexualities, political leanings, joining together, unified by that beautiful word. I jest, of course. Procurement, especially the public variety, is not sexy. It's inescapably unsexy. It's unashamedly dull. It's the overboiled cabbage of governmental activity. So mind-bogglingly uninteresting that if one were to be asked at a dinner party, what do you do? And one responded, I'm in public procurement, your companions would start talking about their self-assessment tax returns and obscure VAT rules in preference. And it's this characteristic that makes me argue that it's perhaps one of the most dangerous elements of a mature democracy, and even more so, developing ones. It's extraordinarily hard to get anybody excited about the ins and outs of the systems controlling public procurement, and so consequently also hard to hold anybody to account. It's not as if the Sun and the Daily Star are going to choose to sell papers with a detailed expose of closed tender contracts when they could otherwise focus on another case of parliamentary boffing. And yet we should be incredibly interested in where our hard-earned tax is eventually getting spent, whose pockets it's lining, and how the rules are ever so gently being massaged. And that's how we find ourselves here, 9 months or so into the first pandemic of the century, and crucially the first pandemic of the digital age, needing desperately to examine where all the money's going. After all, it's going to be those of us in Gens X, Y, and Z that are going to bear the economic brunt of paying all this money back for the longest period of time. The National Audit Office will release full reports into the concerns that have been raised so far in late 2020. And whilst we sit on the edge of our seats awaiting that particular publication, I thought it would be interesting to have a look at a bit of background and some standout moments, a sort of greatest hits of shocking cronyism, if you will. Public procurement tenders are an extraordinarily bureaucratic process. The government body acting as a purchaser must ensure it's getting good value for money and do extensive due diligence on those it's entering into a contract with, for obvious reasons. These normal processes are not well suited to an emergency such as a pandemic, when decisions must be made rapidly, and thus these rules can be suspended when necessary. So on the 18th of March, the Cabinet Office distributed a notice to all public contracting authorities setting out guidance for how procurement can be fast-tracked in this situation. Tendering processes could be skipped due to extreme urgency or due to absence of competition or protection of exclusive rights. It makes perfect sense at its core. It would be unthinkably stupid to jump through bureaucratic hoops to procure an item with only one supplier during a pandemic. What Just Happened wrote extensively at the time about the mess of these first few months in our weekly newsletters, partly because we experienced it firsthand. Businesses across the UK launched straight into action, producing desperately needed supplies such as hand sanitizer, scrubs, masks, pretty much anything else you can imagine. And at first things seemed to go quite well. Individual NHS trusts reacted rapidly to take on unknown suppliers, and then one day the phones all went silent. So that was on the 1st of May when the DHSC, the Department for Health and Social Care, centralised procurement of key medical supplies, including all PPE. So that's your personal protective equipment, masks, gloves, overalls, whatever. Existing stocks and contracts all became the property of central government, who would then handle it from there on. Except it wasn't actually our elected overlords who were in control. The government had subcontracted the role to accountancy firm Deloitte, who set up a cell within the Cabinet Office. Probably nothing to do with Cabinet Minister Chloe Smith having been a consultant at Deloitte or numerous other links. After this point, those of us with supplies available were uniformly told that they weren't needed. Meanwhile, any conversation with clinical staff revealed a desperate need for any PPE that they could get their hands on. I know of many cases where NHS and care staff were reliant on businesses circumventing procurement and the businesses' needs to actually make ends meet and make some money by donating supplies directly at the goods-in entrances of hospitals. The government opened up a web portal inviting suppliers to let them know what could be made available, but it seems that most of those responses were completely ignored. Contracts were being awarded though, and some of these received extraordinary publicity, like the 400,000 gowns that were flown in from Turkey by the RAF after much delay and much mutual backpatting from ministers, only to then all quietly be rejected as unfit for use. Most, though, were kept quiet, and many are only having the details publicised now. So I should note at this point that thankfully I've had to do little in the way of digging and hard lifting, to get the following examples. People like the Good Law Project are hard at work, led by the infamous Joe Morn, who will always be remembered better for famously beating a fox to death in the early morning light wearing his dressing gown and then inadvisedly tweeting about it. So have you heard of PPE MedPro? It's pretty unlikely, since it was only incorporated in mid-May with a standard £100 statement of capital. Its owner is a guy called Anthony Page, who the same day as he established PPE MedPro quit his role as company secretary of the business that manages the brand of Baroness Mohn, the Conservative peer Baroness Mohn. Page is also finance director at Knox Group, which owns a company called Lancaster Knox LLP, an outfit that specialises in handling tax fraud investigations, and has donated £221,000 to the Conservative Party. 44 days later, PPE MedPro, who had no experience, were awarded an unadvertised and uncompetitive contract for £122 million for the supply of medical gowns. So how about Crisp Websites Limited? It's a small company, generally trades under the brand PestFix and occasionally Pigeon Stop. Last year, it reported assets of £18,000. We can assume, though, that its owners certainly do have the asset of having the Midas touch, seeing as they've been awarded a total of, so far, £313.7 million worth of uncontested contracts for various PPE, some £168.5 million worth of which was turned out to be unusable. Luckily, our ever-benevolent government believes in seventh chances, so they paid them up front more than £32 million for a shipment of coveralls. Astonishingly, more contracts have been awarded which haven't been made public yet. Personally, I'm wondering which bank lent a company with assets of 18,000 enough capital to deliver on these contracts. If anybody finds out who that is, I've got a bridge they might like to buy. PestFix actually, interestingly, held a crowdfunder in early April to raise a few £1,000s to buy goods to donate to the to ANHS. Within the crowdfunder, which has now been deleted, they admitted to never having supplied medical PPE before. So PestFix have been one of the benefactors of a remarkable spurt of purchasing overalls, or coveralls rather, I should say. The government won't say how many they've bought, but estimates based on the total spend and the cost per unit puts it at around 29 million. And for reference, so far, since the beginning of the crisis in March, the NHS has only needed 500,000. The items that have been tested to a substandard level by a substandard lab. Of those that have been tested and aren't just sat in a warehouse completely unused. The largest beneficiaries of the coveralls gold rush are an interior design company which specialises in designing offices called Unispace, which have received contracts for £239 million worth. So the other lucky bastards, and excuse it's a list here, is P14 Medical. So that's a loss-making company owned by a Tory councillor, £156 million worth of contracts. Cargo Services Far East Limited, can't find anything about them, £106 million contracts. Medicine Box Limited, a micro company with assets of £40,000, £40 million contracts. Initia Ventures Limited, a dormant company with £100 in assets, £32.5 million contract. SG Recruitment UK Limited, it's a recruitment company which is currently under audit, £23.9 million contracts. Tower Supplies, which isn't, as far as I can see, even a legal entity of any sort, £40.5 million contract. And Cow Media Group Limited, which is a digital media agency, at £19.5 million contract. To maintain impartiality, I should point out the cash grabbing doesn't seem to have been limited to those with Conservative Party affiliations. So Christopher Evans, a Labour Party donor who was arrested in 2007 in the Cash for Honours scandal, is chairman of a company called Excalibur Healthcare. The Isle of Man-based company sourced £135 million worth of ventilators for the NHS at the bargain price of just £50,000 per unit. The same ventilators which it had been selling 3 weeks earlier at £8,800 per unit. So lucky then that the government has an anti-corruption champion. The chap in question is MP John Penrose. That's John Penrose, who's married to Baroness Dido Harding, the former CEO of TalkTalk and Conservative peer, who now somehow has become responsible for the ever-increasing failure that is the test and trace system, the £12 billion failure. The £12 billion failure that last week briefly accidentally made an advert public for a £2,000 a day role as VP of operations to try and sort out some of their useless call centres. So the most astonishing part of this story is I could literally keep going on for page after page after page, but at this point your eyes have glazed over and I'm in the corner in a fetal position vomiting with rage. When all of this comes to a head, it'll be fascinating to see where the line is drawn between incompetence and simple fraud and embezzlement, because this shit stinks, and this is only what's been gleaned from public record documents. It's horrifying to think of profit being skimmed from the public purse during a pandemic by a well-connected minority, whilst the same government won't fund free school meals. But where there's smoke, there's usually fire, and right now this looks like a warehouse full of untested, poorly manufactured fire purchased from Chancellor fire eaters who know the mayor of Fireville. So if you want to find out a little bit more about this, there's a huge number of links and all the documents we back up this on our website, the blog at whatjusthappened.news. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook at WJHblog, and of course here on Instagram at whatjusthappenedblog. And just to give you a little bit of bonus to the blog, which we've already covered, going well into the area of opinion here. It's interesting to see what's happened here, because I'm trying to work out where it's incompetence and where it does look like fraud, because there are elements of this that I suspect are just that people who don't know what they're doing have been put in charge of procuring things. I suspect that in some of these cases, a 21-year-old PPE graduate from Deloitte has been put in charge of trying to buy gowns, for example, and some chancellors have come along who can drop shit something. I mean, anybody can go to Alibaba and find somebody in China or Hong Kong, Indonesia, who's willing to sell you bulk shipment of medical gowns of what standard is questionable. And I suspect that's what some of these companies have done. But where it starts to get a little bit more potentially negligent is the fact that, a lot of these companies don't have the assets to purchase them. They don't have the assets to get a bank loan to purchase them. So that would imply that they've been paid up front by the government for these purchases. So in that case, the government has paid up front to an unknown company with very, very minimal assets for goods that they didn't know the quality of, and in most cases has turned out to be unusable, and to the sum of millions and millions and millions of pounds. And that's where it starts to sort of switch from incompetence to gross criminal negligence, quite frankly. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of potential legal cases coming out of this. It'll be really interesting to see what happens. So follow us on the social medias and whatevers, and if you've got any interesting that you'd like to say about this, get in touch and let's have a debate about it. Thanks for listening.